Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're live here for another Facebook live stream. Thank you for tuning in. This is going to be a wonderful discussion tonight, and I'm sure a lot of you have been looking forward to this one. We started a 3-minute delay, so we're fashionably late, but I'm glad to be joined by my good friend, Dr. Peter Carmichael from the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College, and they are also a co-host of tonight's live stream. So, Pete, thank you for being here and joining us.
Yes, John, thank you. And I will introduce our guest this evening, Harold Holzer. And many of you, if you've not heard Harold speak, I suspect if you have any interest in Abraham Lincoln, you have read one of his either edited or authored books. You have, according to my count, 52. Is that correct, Harold? 53.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
You lost count, Peter.
Wow.
The one that I'll bring special attention to or call attention to is Lincoln and the Power of the Press. I have it right here. It was the Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize winner 3 years ago.
No, 5 years ago.
5 years ago. How time flies. As many of you know, the Lincoln Prize is also co-sponsored with Gettysburg College. I should also note that Harold is the Jonathan Fanton, director of the Hunter College Roosevelt House School of Public Policy. That's a lot to get out, man. I know you're not back at Hunter College now, but they were doing some work to the Roosevelt House. Were you able to get back into it before you then had to evacuate because of the virus?
I did. I got in. I got some books that I'm reviewing. So I took all I could get. It was like in and out, and the house is closed. But like you guys, we've kind of converted to online education, and beginning tonight, online public programs. We had some health experts tonight or this evening talking about the pandemic and healthcare in the United States, and we're going to alternate between history from our archives and current events. The best we can do, but there seems to be a big appetite for it here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Harold, we will have some of our viewers sending in questions here in just a little bit. We should also note here that you've received the National Humanities Medal on 2 occasions, 2008 and 2013, I believe.
No, just one.
Just one.
Just 2008. You can only get it once.
I was trying to give you twice. I thought that sounded odd. Yeah. You deserved it twice, though, Harold. I think, again, that speaks to what Harold has done throughout his career. He's very much a public intellectual. He has reached out to audiences about Lincoln and about the Civil War. And one of his main platforms that he is a part of, and now I would say El Jefe of, is the Lincoln Forum. And if you could just talk a little bit about the forum, what it meets, what it does.
Okay. Well, I'm branded this evening.
You are
I thought
branded.
it was appropriate.
Well, Harold, before you go any further, I think, John, we have it. There he is, your tattoo. We've offered Harold, Harold gets a 10% discount from General Pickett's Tattoo Parlor right here in Gettysburg. And if he doesn't use it, Harold, I'm quite certain that there's a loose network of tattoo parlors that stretch all the way into New York City. So you can get the job done right there.
I know just where they are.
Right. They don't take charge at Pickett's place, though.
Okay.
So
So
go tell us a little bit about the forum.
yeah, so the Lincoln Forum is we call it a family. It's an organization with about 700 members, and we meet every November 16th to 18th to be precise, right there in Gettysburg. Peter, as you well know, you were one of our featured speakers last year with your new book, and we started in the old days at the old. You guys will know these places, but the old Holiday Inn downtown. That's the one that's attached to the Jenny Wade House, with about 80 or 90 people and a 2-day conference. And we've grown over the years. We moved out to the Wyndham on the confluence of routes, I guess it's 30 and 15.
Correct.
And we had 330 people last year, and terrific presentations. So we meet for 3 days. We hear speakers. We have breakout sessions, panels, dinner meetings. We give out awards, and we have a terrific time talking about history, talking about Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War. And this November, if we get a grace period from the emergency we're all living through now, we will be marking our 25th anniversary as an organization with all sorts of extra activities that we're very happy that Peter Carmichael has agreed to be part of, with a prequel, a day in advance of our event. We can only hope, we're planning for the best, and cognizant of the fact that we don't know what's going to happen in November, but we're going to plan ahead. All of our speakers are enthusiastically agreed to come, and it would just be, talk about a pressure valve being released. It would be a great thing if we could all get together safely and together in Gettysburg.
I just want to say I've been to the forum a few times and have spoken and know many of the members there. And I want to reiterate Harold's point that, it is a sort of a family-like atmosphere in which, even if you feel like you don't really know a lot about Lincoln or a lot about the Civil War, but you've got a lot of enthusiasm and passion for the subject, it is a place in which, one, the talks are accessible and they're engaging, and two, you're going to be surrounded by just really nice collegial people. And it's a real joy. I've so enjoyed it. And I think the other thing that the forum does, and sort of God's work, I believe, and that is scholarships for young people, high school students. You all have always been so generous in trying to get Gettysburg College students to come. And of course, the challenge is that they often have to miss classes, which they really can't do. And so they've not ever had a really strong presence there. I hope that we can maybe change that somehow. But
thank you for mentioning the scholarship programs, because we do student scholarships and teacher scholarships.
And teachers, yes, that's right.
And also an essay contest for college undergraduates, all of which, if I can just presume to do one little plug, if there are teachers out there and students or parents of students who are interested in those scholarships, they're on our website, which is thelincolnforum.org. Easy to find. And
you also have a Facebook page too, your organization?
We do. Not that I know how to direct people to it, but if you know how to find things on Facebook, we do have a Facebook page.
Right. So if they wanted to come to the conference in the fall, they should look at the Facebook or go to the homepage. And again,
become a member, and then become a member and sign on. Yeah,
become a member and sign on. And we are organizations, we are kissing cousins of sorts, CWI and the Lincoln Forum. We have members in both, although we are not a membership-based organization, but we certainly draw from the same speaker pool. In fact, I'm very disappointed to announce that Gettysburg College has canceled all summer programming, including the CWI conference. And Harold was going to come this summer, and he was going to speak about Mary Lincoln with
Catherine Clinton.
That's right. That was
very sad when this domino effect of things that mark your calendar out into the summer and beyond sort of fall. And I'm going to miss the Institute. I've been to maybe 10 of them over the years, and they are also a phenomenon and a great place of friendship and student activity.
Well, we will have quite a reunion, and I suspect that reunion will be, I hope, in 2021. Mr. G's Ice Cream for All will be our rallying cry.
Ice
Every
cream
Friday night.
That's worth a visit. That ice cream.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm going to make the rough transition now to this evening's conversation. This evening's conversation is a look back on Lincoln's leadership at a time of crisis. And we're going to then use that as a platform from which Harold will just again sort of riff here and his vast knowledge of Lincoln and how presidents over time have drawn upon the legacy of the president, how maybe in some ways they have tried to use Lincoln's historical legacy during their own moments of trial. And so, we'll just go ahead and get started with what I think is a nice, easy question.
Okay.
And that is, I'd like for you to tell us about Lincoln's first crisis as a president, as soon as he took the oath, and that's a deep South that has, by the time he's taken office, almost entirely pulled out of the Union. I'd like for you to just sort of reflect upon how Lincoln handled this, and tried to manage this situation, and how, again, he tried to sort of project himself as to the American people during this moment.
I would just turn the question a little bit by saying, as I happen to be reading Ted Whitmer's new book, Lincoln on the Verge, about the inaugural journey. And I would say he was in crisis from election day forward, not even before he took the oath. And that was because secession took place so quickly. He was whipsawed, Lincoln was whipsawed by demands that he either conciliate the South or take a tough stance against secession. He had 4 or 5 ex-presidents at his heels who were all disdainful of him. He had one of the ex-presidents leading a peace conference in Washington, D.C., proposing solutions that he had not signed off on.
Who's that ex-president?
John Tyler. Yeah. And also faced the threat that he might not even make it to the inauguration, and had to make his first major decision, which he later said he regretted, but I think he didn't have much choice, and that is whether to proceed with his public schedule through the Southern Territory, slaveholding territory in Maryland, or do a dodge and make sure he got to Washington safely. And he, of course, as we know, as all Lincoln aficionados know, he chose discretion over valor and snuck through Baltimore in the dead of night in semi-disguise and got to Washington. So that was crisis number one.
Well, we should, I think, though, in defense of John Tyler, if you can't be effective when you're a president, why not try to leave a mark when you're an ex-president?
Well, he left a mark. He had, what did he have, 17 children?
Yeah, crazy. Yeah, crazy number.
By the way, he has, I will say one thing about the Tyler genetic. He has a grandson.
Yeah, that's right.
Who was alive as we speak. And
Yep.
he was president in the 1840s. It's kind of mind-boggling. Anyway, so of course the crisis to which you refer is that of coming to Washington, making a kind of a peace overture with the inaugural address, which in its draft form was much tougher than the one he delivered. It ended with not the famous words about the better angels of our nature, which were added later, but the choice is up to you. Will it be peace or a sword? It was kind of defiant. So he was conciliatory, but it didn't work. Secession didn't end. And the big crisis was Fort Sumter. I think that's the one you wanted me to get to. So I'll do it quickly, and then you can.
You can get whatever you want. No?
All right. So locals in the newly organized Confederate States of America are seizing federal property, arsenals, forts, postal buildings. In the argument, their argument was it's in our territory and we're taking them. The federal argument is we built them and they belong to the federal government. And the big examples were the forts in Florida and South Carolina. Fort Sumter is the one we all remember. There were actually a few forts in Charleston. The garrisons all coalesced in Fort Sumter because it was on an independent island. I think it's a man-made island. I don't remember. I think so. And the South Carolinians demanded the fort. Major Robert Anderson in command waited for instructions. And Lincoln had to decide, do I take my stand for the Union at Fort Sumter? His Secretary of the State suggested they get out of Sumter fast and maybe make a stand in Florida, Fort Pickens. But Lincoln, his ingenious response, I think, was to announce that he wasn't going to refortify or rearm the fort, but would resupply it with provisions to provide sustenance to the men who were still serving. That provoked the firing on Fort Sumter in April 1861 and made Lincoln kind of able to rally the North for a time in defense of the traducing of the flag, as the phrase went then. So I think he handled that crisis well. Should he have announced a blockade within a few days that helped, along with a call for volunteers, to provoke the Upper South out of the Union, or the North Carolina and Virginia? That's open to debate, I guess, but especially the blockade. But it was effective, but was it?
So I'm going to press here a little bit.
Yeah. Okay.
And again, I don't like to criticize a fellow Hoosier, being Abraham Lincoln. I consider Indiana to be that crucial time period, his formative years, where his.
Yes, I've heard that from many Hoosiers.
You say he handled this well, he navigated it well, but I could say it seems to me that it was an abysmal failure because at the end of the day, the Union, he wasn't able, of course, to somehow bring it back together, which is maybe asking too much. So, okay, we give him a break on that, but okay, old Abe, don't get us into a war here. When we think about the bloodletting that then followed, that should not Lincoln be judged on the fact that he succumbed to, and I'm going to butcher Lincoln's words here so you can clean them up for me, in which didn't he say that if he had to be sort of honest, frank, that he possessed little control over events, that events controlled him. Now, whether he actually said that or not, it's difficult to say, but does not that remind us that at a moment of crisis, a moment when we needed a man to maybe stand up and to stop this madness from occurring, he in fact knew exactly what would happen, not only after he let, or I should say, as you pointed out, really forced the Confederate hand, right? But then made it worse by demanding that those states that had not seceded to raise troops to suppress the rebellion. That pushes out Virginia, as you well know, pushes out North Carolina, pushes out Tennessee, pushes out Arkansas. So with that little mini speech that I just gave.
So I know you're only playing devil's advocate.
Maybe I'm not.
Okay, I'm not going to ask because it's a legitimate question. So I think you heard me question the blockade and the immediate call for volunteers, although I think it's understandable in the aftermath of what had been a firing on the American flag by Americans. But two things I wanted to address from your counter there. One is I take Lincoln at his word on most of the things he says. I don't take him at his word on events have controlled me. I never have. He said it. He wrote it in defense of Black recruitment a couple of years later as an explanation to a border state editor of why a man who, in 1858 had said he didn't believe that Blacks could serve as jurors or as equals in any legal sense could now take up arms. He brushes it off by saying I don't claim I've controlled events, but that events have controlled me. I used to have fights with David Donald about that. He was actually going to call his book "Events Have Controlled Me," but wiser minds took over that enterprise. I believe, though, that he was telling the truth and sort of in a bit of a confessional in the second inaugural when he said that when he was at the corresponding event 4 years earlier, there were people in Washington dedicated to destroying the Union without war or destroying it with war. And he said, but he added, no one imagined then the duration or the magnitude of what would happen. So looking back at 750,000 lives lost, can you say he should have found another way? Yes, but giving up the Union, and I think was an impossibility for him then. And he thought wrongly, as it turned out, that calling up volunteers and suppressing the rebellion quickly, like July, which is what he hoped, would end it.
I take it once.
And a misjudgment, clearly, but there's also a sense of inevitability there.
I'll just take it one step further. Yeah, I was playing devil's advocate, although that is a position, an argument that certainly we've heard Lincoln's critics make. And we've heard others who just simply say, as you point out, that 750,000 casualties, or maybe more than that, that somehow, some way that the political system that became so dysfunctional needed to function, right? And that we have individuals in the wake of Lincoln's election, such as Critton and others, who were putting forth a compromise. And I'll say, I'm glad they failed. And I'm glad they failed because what do you say to an enslaved person in 1860? Well, it's not your time, but maybe it's the next generation's time, or maybe the next generation after that. I mean, the moment had come, and there again was where I have great admiration for Lincoln, because it is in that moment he did not act like a politician. It is in that moment he said, "We're not kicking this can anymore. We're going to face this issue."
Absolutely.
Even if it means, of course, the division of the country and horrible casualties.
Boy, it's hard to keep up with you, Peter. I have to say one step ahead of you, or I'm going to really fall behind here. But talk about but he was political, right?
Absolutely,
quintessentially political. So while of course he is not willing to compromise on slavery expansion, he's not willing to compromise on the sanctity of the Union. He is willing to send the amendment that comes out of Crittenden's compromise, the first 13th Amendment. He sends it to all the states for ratification. I mean, he doesn't send a message with it saying, this is the stupidest thing I've ever seen, because it says slavery will not be debated ever in the halls of Congress and everything stays the same, not only for the next generation, but for eternity. He sent it, and they keep discovering these messages in the archives of individual states. I think a couple of states actually ratified the amendment, including Ohio, if I'm not sure, under Tom Corwin's aegis. So it was a strange time.
Wow.
But I'm glad we got you back in the Lincoln folder. I was worried for a minute.
Well, I'm a little bit harder on Lincoln on some other things that I think everyone's given him a free pass, including our dear friend, a scholar that I admire so much, is James McPherson. I think that, well, we have to talk about the politics and Lincoln's handling of the high command of Union armies. I'll let John, I'm sure, has a question here for you.
Yeah, I was wondering, since we were just talking about the Upper South and the firing on Fort Sumter and such, Lincoln's handling of the border state crisis and how he politics with that and maneuvers around that. I think that's an important story that's often overlooked. What are your thoughts on how he handled, especially like Maryland and Kentucky and places in that regard?
I just had a thought that I hadn't considered before, but it's in the pandemic of secession, a century and a half ago, Lincoln sort of had a state-by-state strategy. He didn't let the governors do what they wanted, but he had a state-by-state strategy. Mm-hmm. So in Missouri, he's willing to fight. In Kentucky, he says, I must have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky. Delaware, he ignores. And Maryland, he declares martial law, basically locks up the state legislature. Anybody who is pushing back against Union supremacy. He meets the mayor of Baltimore, tells him, we have a really important local decision that we're making here, and that is that all of these soldiers you're sending here from New York and New England, they can't come through Baltimore because it's dangerous. And Mr. Lincoln, what could be more obvious than, you dodged Baltimore. We don't want any trouble. And Lincoln says, my soldiers are not birds. They can't fly. They're not fish. They can't swim. And they're not moles. They can't bore under the earth. So they will come through Baltimore. And of course, they were attacked on the same railroad cut line that Lincoln would have been attacked on, I think, in February 1861. Anyway, so yeah, state by state strategy. And as I discussed a few years ago in the book that Peter was generous enough to hold up to the screen, part of that was suppression of opposition newspapers. There it is again. General Fremont, General Grant in their early days were happily confiscating printing presses, arresting editors, and shutting down anti-union journalism in Missouri. In Kentucky, editors were imprisoned. They were shipped. One of them I trace in the book was shipped off to Brooklyn, to Fort Lafayette, and waited months before Secretary Seward heard his case. And of course, all of these folks were arrested and locked up without a civil trial without habeas corpus and without a hearing. So it was a period where I think he had a state by state, almost a county by county strategy, and he was tough as nails and extra constitutional, some might argue as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. So again, let's just think big here about a way of characterizing, if we can, Lincoln's leadership. And what you just explained to us, it seems to me that it's a president who at his very core a pragmatist. And you can either affirm or disagree with that, but I just want you again to reflect on another point that's related, and that is, it seems to me that pragmatism in politics today is impossible. That for whatever reason, Americans can't recognize a good idea as a good idea and what its outcome might be and how it might benefit, the most. Rather, it's so now rooted in partisanship. And more importantly, pragmatism today now is almost viewed as a loss of principle, right? That you don't really stand for something, that you're bending to accommodate someone else or accommodate a particular interest. And so, Lincoln's politics of pragmatism, which I think is maybe, a way of understanding his handling of military affairs, how he deals with emancipation, how he deals with internal dissent. Is that a way of understanding Lincoln? And have we lost it, as I think we have, in today's political world?
I think that's a really terrific analysis. I mean, I think we do have to concede, though, that Lincoln's rise may have been attributed to a careful pragmatism and to reaching for, the limits of the possible within the constraints of a kind of racist society and a different regional aspirations and mores. But once the Southern states leave, he has kind of an easier time of it politically. He's really battling with Northern Democrats, and think of all of the voters whose opinions don't matter for the whole 4 years of his administration. He's really should be speaking only to the converted. He's speaking to the North. The 1862 elections are in the North, the congressionals. The 1863 big gubernatorial election is in Ohio. It's not in the South. And 64 is just the North. So he gets to be a little more principled and a little tougher because he doesn't have that big chunk of opposition. They fortuitously, if you want to be, absent the bloodshed and the destruction, they've conveniently left the Union and left it with a much, much freer hand. But pragmatism is not the only thing that I think characterizes leadership. There are so many sterling qualities that he brought to a crisis. And I always think one of the biggest ones is a kind of modesty. He was in his core he had a self-confident person. He had no doubts about his own ability. And there's a famous story about his first meeting with Charles Sumner in Washington. Sumner, Harvard educated, a diplomat, worldly, spoke languages.
Probably insufferable.
Insufferable. Or as Lincoln said, my idea of a bishop, comes to the Willard Hotel to meet him for the first time, convinced that he's going to wrap this hick or Hoosier hick around his fingers and tell him what to do. And when he left, they said, someone said, Senator, how was the meeting? He said, I've never met a man who's more arrogant and had more sense of superiority than this man. He's insufferable. So Lincoln rose to the occasion. But one of the things he did is sort of put away petty argumentation. Long before he so beautifully said malice toward none, he used the word again or previously and said, what I'm doing is too big for malice. He didn't care about petty conflicts. There's a famous story of General McClellan, not his greatest choice for command, but treating him with such great disrespect, and Lincoln telling a friend, or I think it was John Hay or John Nicolay, I would hold McClellan's horse if he would bring me victories. He was also smart enough to know what he didn't know. Look at the reading lists of the books he borrowed from the Library of Congress at the start of the secession crisis. He took out Henry Halleck's books on military strategy. And within a year, he seemed to know more about Joint Command and
Halleck did.
than anybody did.
Right.
So his
Probably-
autodidactic
Probably learned to look the other way and to not get
Yeah.
into any kind of petty exchanges. Living with Mary Lincoln, and I'm being serious. I suspect that, of course, if he, you would have little skirmishes almost every day with her if you did not just say, you know what, I'm just going to move on.
Yeah, or whoever you want me to appoint to office, I will do this.
And there again, I think that there is just cause to have a hard look at Lincoln, who, for some generals, Ben Butler, Hunter, Banks, these are political appointees. These are men who had demonstrated time and time again that they were not capable, qualified to lead men in the field. And the consequence of Lincoln staying by them for really political reasons is a lot of Northern soldiers died needlessly. Now, others could counter, including James McPherson, to say that without those political appointees, that you are not going to be able to mobilize Northern people to serve in the ranks. I just disagree with that. You got to draft, and you didn't need to stick by those men.
Well, what you mean, stick by them after the draft began?
Yeah,
I think Jim McPherson is right that the enlisting the support of Democratic generals and colonels was crucial to making the war not a Republican war but a Union war. And also, I remember John Y. Simon rolling these German names off, Schimmelpfennig and others. You know, getting German generals, getting some Irish commanders was crucial because of the number of immigrants and first generation people living in America. So yeah, so your point is that these stuck with them too long.
Too long. I mean, certainly by late 63, early 64, you've reached a point in the war where I'm not sure that's necessary. Obviously, it's easy for me to make that kind of a call, but I think that, again, we need to take a hard look at that, as well as
also trying to win some pro-war Democrats in 1862 elections and in 1864 as well. I'm not sure he did, but so there are still political reasons, because without the commander-in-chief in place, as Lincoln said more than once, the whole game is lost. And I would argue about Butler, beloved of African-American troops, right? Even created a medal for them to congratulate them on their valor in a battle. I forget the battle, but I think he cost many soldiers their lives in the battle, and Grant relieved him. But they weren't even allowed to wear the Butler medal because it wasn't. What is it? What do you call it? Ordained or
by the War Department. It hasn't been approved.
Right. I've seen a few of those. They're pretty amazing.
So, John, I'm going to throw in one last quick question here, and then run in, and that's because you've just mentioned the '64 election, and I'd like Harold to give our audience what you think historians their general assessment of that election, how we should look at it. Is it something that is a moment in our history that we should sort of embrace and take pride in? Or do you have maybe a different take on the '64 election? So give our audience a little bit of background, what do historians think, and then, curious.
This is to me?
Yeah.
So I think the most important thing about the 1864 election has always been that it took place in the midst of a civil war. I think it's a lesson and a precedent that should govern all of our future contests. That the idea that Lincoln had, that if the election was postponed, then secession and disunion would have succeeded automatically, even without a vote of the people. And even as we begin to hear whispers, rumors that the pandemic could force us, heaven forbid, to use mail ballots or other quote unquote untrustworthy sources of casting ballots, that there is no way to postpone a national election in the United States, that we've had them through wars and through rebellions, and they are crucial. And the fact that he permitted it when he cracked down so much on constitutionally guaranteed rights to reunite the country is an extraordinary testament to him. So that's the most important thing. I think my friend Jonathan White has pointed out that the legendary 80% approval he got from the soldiers in the separately counted soldiers vote can be questioned a bit because so much Republican politicking was going on, so much shame heaped upon his opponents in what was anything but a secret ballot in those days, and so much censorship of Democratic newspapers, as I pointed out. It was pretty hard to get a Democratic newspaper, except for the New York Herald, maybe, which was in the middle of the road there, into camps. So a mixed bag, but I just think a triumph of the original intent of the founders, that they be elections every 4 years.
So, John, your thoughts about the 64 election?
I really think it's an interesting subject to cover because I'm from South Central Pennsylvania, and parts of the area flipped in 1864 from Republican to Democrat, which is really interesting to me because the war came through this area in 63 en masse. And it's a really interesting thing to think about, especially Adams County, where Gettysburg is, flipped Democrat in 64. And I've often wondered why that might have been. I know there's a strong Democratic presence in the area, but it's an interesting thing to think about. If it could flip in Gettysburg and Adams County, where else was this going on? And we actually just had a question come across about the 64 election. It said, Christopher Powers says, what made the Democrats think that McClellan was capable of winning the 64 election? Which is an interesting question too.
Well, he's a war hero, and in the eyes of many, still, despite his failures. But he didn't have any battlefield defeats, really, to speak of. I mean, you could call the 7 Days Campaign, as he would have called it, McClellan, as a changing or shifting a basis, and that was not just a euphemism. I mean, that's exactly what McClellan did. He rescues the army after Manassas, and Antietam is, it's a tactical victory. Some people might argue that it's a draw, and he's, of course, beloved by his soldiers, even to the bitter end, even if they break with him politically. So he's a pretty attractive candidate. And of course, he has a political philosophy that speaks to most mainstream war Democrats. And
I think Lincoln was demonstrably fearful up until the eve of the Democratic convention that he was going to be beaten by McClellan. I mean, he forces his cabinet members to sign on to a pledge to cooperate with the incoming administration, because today, as for some days now, it seems likely that this administration will be defeated. And just to John's point, New York State also, which united behind a single Democratic candidate in 1860, an effort to coalesce anti-Lincoln sentiment, was weaker for Lincoln in 1864 than in 1860. I think Lincoln understood that, what he said, the heavens are hung with black. The death had touched every family in some way. Had a member or a friend or a distant relative who had been consumed by the war, or was serving and was in danger and in harm's way. So I think the losses were incalculable, and understandably, lots of otherwise diehard Republicans wanted that bloodletting to end. And Lincoln had taken a huge risk by adding Black freedom to his rationale for running and for the war. That was a complete change from what he had said in 1860, or even in before September 1862. So the fact that he won it all is kind of remarkable. And thank you.
It is remarkable. Ed Ayers, formerly University of Virginia, then president of University of Richmond, he gave a talk at the Institute in which he simply looked at the popular vote in 64. And to my surprise, it's extraordinarily close. I mean, it's a landslide electoral college.
Yeah.
And you just, you got to only imagine Lincoln thinking, good God, what do I need to do? I have secured a number of important victories, from the fall of Atlanta to Mobile and Shenandoah Valley. Clearly, the Confederacy's on its ropes, and still, Lincoln, damn near lost it.
Yeah.
I want you all to give me your opinions about this, and I might be discrediting myself here. in listening to Alan Dershowitz during the impeachment trial in the Senate, in which he was trying to make a case that in the past that there had been violations of the Constitution that had been far more significant than the charges that the House of Representatives had voted in the impeachment. And one of the things that Mr. Dershowitz brought up was the 64 election. He said, when you look at the 64 election, for some reason, Dershowitz picked on my state and said there were examples in which Indiana troops were not permitted to vote. And I don't know if that specific is correct, but all of us here know that wasn't a democratic election. It was far from it. Hell, when you are allowing Republican regiments to come home and to vote, and you're denying Democratic regiments to do it. Now, listen, I'm glad the election came, and I'm certainly thankful that Lincoln won it. But don't you think that this is an instance in which we want to have that feel-good story about Lincoln and about our Civil War? I mean, this to me is a moment in which we look at the 64 election and we look at it, right, by pulling the curtains back and saying, here's your democracy, the American people. It is rough, it is ugly, and often it is what? It's in the gutter and dirty.
Yeah.
That's the 64.
I don't think, I'm not even going to comment on Alan Dershowitz. I will say, I'm really glad that I did this, that I got to sit in the Senate chamber for about an hour and a half with my wife, thanks to Senator Durbin. So watch some of the trial, which was really fascinating, dull, but in the end, right, with all the formalities and the pomp that attended every question. Yeah. I don't think you can make anything but a virtue of Lincoln's insistence on having the election. There are dirty politics in American elections, from 1800 on, and it's tough out there, and people don't want people not to vote, and they want their people to vote. And look, the soldiers vote. The whole soldiers vote idea is revolutionary. Not denying the franchise to people just because they're serving their country.
Yeah, but Harold, you have to admit, we look the other way when Stanton in particular, this isn't just some dirty tricks, right? I mean, this isn't nickel and dime stuff. This is denying people their right to the franchise because they were of the other party. It was not a legit election. I mean, I think we need
unless you show me a hand count of your so-called Democratic regiments and Republican regiments, I'm not going to buy into it.
I'm going to get Jonathan White on speed dial, and he can fill in.
I like his book a lot, and yes, not only those who were allowed to go home, but there was a little bit of voter repression or shaming in camp. But listen, look at the account of Lincoln's voting on Election Day 1860 in Springfield. There was like frenzy in the streets, and 2 giant glass bowls set up in the Springfield courthouse. And when you went into the polling place, you got a Republican ballot first or a Democratic ballot. And nobody thought there was a secret ballot. And there was pressure. People were yelling and screaming, don't vote for Lincoln. Lincoln tears his own name off the ballot in this big demonstration of modesty. I don't think it was any rougher than any other election.
It's like the Iowa caucus.
It's not that close of an election. It's like 53.5 to 46.5. So that's a pretty good. Most presidential elections are pretty close.
Yeah, pretty close.
They're not all 1964 and 1984 or 1972.
John, go ahead.
I remember the landslide. 36.
I was talking with some people earlier who follow the page, and a lot of people who follow my page really got into Lincoln due to popular history, and it was mainly because of seeing the movie and the back and forth with the cabinet and his staff and such. How did Lincoln use his cabinet to his advantage? Because he wasn't someone who thought he knew everything and he could just do it all himself. He relied on different sorts of people to do his job.
I think he was always a delegator, and he remember the cabinet selection in the Lincoln era was not done in the manner in which it was done in I would say from the 70s until 2017. In recent generations, cabinets have been named according to, to create kind of the look of America: gender balance, ethnic balance, racial balance, or not balance, but representation. In Lincoln's day, it was all about regional representations, and the states that had voted loyally and heavily for Lincoln, especially those that had been consequential at the Republican convention by switching votes, got rewarded. So the big states that had to be taken care of were Ohio, Indiana, New York, Illinois. Lincoln's friends in Illinois said, "Who are you going to pick from Illinois?" And he said, "I'm from Illinois. Nobody else gets picked." In Pennsylvania. So they all got a seat at the table. And they barely knew most of them. He'd met Seward once or twice. He corresponded with him during the secession winter. He knew Chase a bit. He knew Bates. Bates came to see him in Springfield. It's a remarkable thing that I'm going to get a visit from a cat here in a minute. He doesn't like my being on my computer. Sorry about that. Hello.
Use a cat vote here on my stream. Go ahead, Harold.
So now I've been distracted. If I put her down, she's going to bite me. So I have
to leave her up.
I have to humor her here. He had good people there, and the other thing that people I don't think have full knowledge of, it's kind of obscure, but it's interesting, is that for a while, Lincoln's cabinet functioned the way an Israeli cabinet functions today. That is, they had to vote on issues of policy. And it was very difficult for Lincoln to go forward with things without the consent of the cabinet. He sort of, by emancipation time, he said, "Okay, I know I'm supposed to bring this to you." The second time he brought emancipation to the cabinet. So, but this time I made a pact with God that if we drove Lee out of Maryland, we were going to do the emancipation. So I don't need your vote.
Do you think anyone really believed that when he said, "I made a pact with God"? There's no way they can't believe that. I mean,
nobody objected this time. There's no record.
That's because that's just the kind of thing you can't object to.
Did they believe him? I think he prayed. He prayed for his life. He prayed for the Union's life during that Maryland invasion, right? So it's okay. I was right. God is on my side after all.
Yeah. So, John, your favorite Lincoln moment of the war, John? And then I'm curious what what Harold thinks about it.
Wow, that puts me on the spot there.
Favorite moment.
Favorite moment.
Yeah, our moment, incident, whatever.
It just in the Civil War era or antebellum too?
Yeah, I mean, if you wanted to do before the war, that's fine as well too.
But. I like his speech about a house divided against itself cannot stand, which comes from the Bible. Mm-hmm. But I've actually stood in the chamber where he said that, and that really struck me as a speech that's often forgotten about. We cut that one line out, and that's all we take, and we put it over here, kind of like second inaugural with malice towards none and such. So I think his pre-war years, where he actually showcases that he is against slavery going further west and such, that's often forgotten about by some people because they come back to 1860, 1861 and say, see, he doesn't care what happens with slavery. He'll save the Union while leaving half enslaved and let half free. In his antebellum years, he's showcasing that he doesn't believe that years before that. But that speech that he gives about a house divided against itself is one of my favorite times of his political career. I mean, without those moments, he wouldn't have a presidency, in my opinion. I don't have Harold's knowledge, but I think in my opinion, like I love his early days where he's just making a mark, and the Lincoln Douglas debates are just part of that too, where I remember watching as a kid the reenactments of the Lincoln Douglas debates on C-SPAN, and that really took me for a ride with the Lincoln subject.
Yeah, I liked everything you said up until the part where you said you were a kid doing the reenactment. That was painful.
Sorry,
because I wasn't even young for that. Yeah. So
you got to cut my feet off now.
Can I tell you one story about? I think what John describes is something amazing about being on the site where these events took place and standing at that rostrum in State Capitol in Springfield has that effect. The place for me, the talismanic place is Cooper Union because it's here in New York. My first cousin went there years and years, I think more than maybe 65 years ago he graduated. And he took me there when I was a kid. And I wrote a book about just that speech. That's my.
We're ready.
Hilarious.
Thank you. So can I tell you a quick name dropping story about my experience with Cooper Union?
I love name
I was speaking at a New York private school a few years ago, and I got questions from kids, and then the parents were asked if they wanted to ask questions. So a man stood up in the back and said something similar to what Peter has said. If you could be at any speech that Abraham Lincoln ever delivered, what would it be? So I said Cooper Union, and he said not the Gettysburg Address. And I'm looking into the audience, and I realize it was Jerry Seinfeld.
No way.
So he said not the Gettysburg Address, and I said not that there's anything wrong with that. The audience cracked up, but he didn't. He didn't like that.
He did.
No, he didn't like it. But so here's my point: Cooper Union. Who wants to wait out there for hours at Gettysburg and then do 3 minutes when you could sit in these luxurious seats and listen to 2 hours of Abraham Lincoln? So that's the moment for me when he shows, and beyond the glib response, the fact that he is able to captivate a snobbish elite New York audience, which is not predisposed to being persuaded by this famous debater, this frontier debater.
It's still not.
Just as a curiosity to see him. I think that's the moment where that's the make or break moment for him in his career, is winning. And of course, he doesn't get any support at the convention from New York, but he gets the press, and that was the important thing.
This is a fantastic book. I mean, you've done so much, right? But I think it's an important book. It's beautifully well written. This book will stand the test of time.
Well, thank you, Peter.
It's really quite good. So, Harold, at this time, this tumultuous time, this time of crisis that's facing the globe, and a time in which we often, are searching and seeking for things in the past, for inspiration, for reassurance, for direction. And so when you think about Lincoln, how do you draw upon, of course, you have this vast knowledge, as John pointed out, but where should we look in terms of Lincoln's either actions or his words? Like, where should we go?
What should we read or write, or what should we think about, or all of the above?
All of the above, man. It's all connected.
I mean, what we always need in America is someone who rises to the occasion, who reflects the American spirit of equality of opportunity, who has lived that dream and can express it rhetorically in words and be inspiring, has modesty and humor. I just worry about looking to the past in some way, because Lincoln said it so beautifully, that the dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. It's kind of hard to think that a 19th century leader could deal with, or automatically deal with, the crises that we face in the early 21st century. Although the character elements that he brought to leadership are ones that we need to look for. The sympathy, the empathy. I don't know where we find it again. There's never going to be another Lincoln, I fear. But again, understanding America and reflecting America in words it's harder than ever. There are 300 million people, not the fraction of people who were alive in 1860.
Right.
And we are divided. And where is our new Lincoln? I don't know.
So, John, I would just have some final thoughts here, and then I will bring it back to Harold and see if we have any questions from the audience. But for you, John, when you think about this moment that we are enduring, is there a way that you find inspiration and comfort from Lincoln, from, again, as being a kid and going to that special place where Lincoln gave the House Divided speech? Does the past comfort you in any way?
I found that as a kid, I was always comforted by the past because I could lose myself in the pages of any book, and I could live multiple lives through the pages of a book. But I'm really, I'm really optimistic, which I think we need to keep in mind about the future of where we're heading. And I also think this is a great time for reflection. And I think we're seeing that on a mass scale. We're taking a crisis that we are living through right now, and we are looking at ourselves and what we have taken for granted, and just being able to watch a baseball game or just whatever it may be. We've taken it for granted for so long. And I really think that when we look back on the times where we had the Lincoln administration and such, and really see what a divided nation who decides they just can't deal with it anymore does to each other. It's we are divided politically along very harsh lines, but we can look back to the past for a little bit of inspiration, because there was this idea of pragmatism, and there was this idea of helping each other out, even if we are from opposite sides of the spectrum. And when we're going through a crisis as we're going through now, it knows no political party or affiliation. We're all going through it together. And I think that when we look back on it that way, we can maybe learn some more lessons from the past in general. I think there's a lot we could learn from not only Lincoln's era, but others as well.
Well, what both of you have to say about this issue, I think it is compelling and important. And again, it reminds me, Harold, that this tendency that I think a lot of people have who are deeply interested in the past and want to believe that somehow either the past repeats itself, or that in the past we can find answers to our present crises. And I think, as you both said, and Harold, you in particular, the idea that a 19th century leader could somehow be better equipped to contend with the issues that we're confronting now is the kind of wishful thinking that I think reflects what I believe one of the major problems that's confronting us as Americans. And it is a naivete / idealism about American politics. It's always been ugly. It's always been bitter. It's always been in the gutter, because it's not republicanism with a small r. It's democracy. And as Harold, as you have, I think, done with such great skill, and I think with balance, and the word that you both have used is empathy. And you've done that with Lincoln. You have enabled us to understand how this man could be so savvy politically, could be so tough-minded, but never tough-hearted, right? There is always a compassion to that man, even when he had to do some ugly things. And so I think, again, Harold, what you said, and John as well, boy, those are the characteristics, right, that we need to see, not just in our leaders, but amongst Americans. And we are. I tell folks that all the time. You come here to this battlefield and you go to the McPherson Woods, and I describe the McPherson Woods in the evening of July the 1st, where Union soldiers are left for dead. These wounded men are crying out for water. No one's helping them, and no surprise there, they're behind Confederate lines. But of course, like on every battlefield, there are thieves, and there are Confederates stealing from these men. It's a horrible sight. And so on the one hand, we should always remember that and that ugliness of this place. But as all of us know, and our listeners know, you can go on almost any Civil War battlefield and find these great acts of humanity and decency. And so we can only hope, right, that the past will at least give us the confidence that we know And I'm sure, Harold, you've seen it every day around New York City now of people coming together to pull through this thing. So, I can't say enough about not just Harold's scholarship, but as you all can tell, if you've not heard Harold speak before, he is such a captivating speaker. It knows, and this is an age thing, right? You know a lot of stuff, man. How did you know all that? Right?
By the way, I fear that after listening to both of you speak so eloquently that I came off as a little bit cynical here.
No, you did not.
I don't want to leave a cynical note. I mean, I wouldn't have spent 50 years with Abraham Lincoln if I didn't think that it was an inspiring pursuit. I will say the one big difference about New York now is that we can't do anything together. We have to do everything apart.
Yes.
That's very painful. It's very lonely, and it's very difficult. Where our families are divided into supposedly safe and secure places, and it's totally unheard of. And it's very interesting to see what leaders are emerging as people we can trust by being factual and honest and tough about staying away from each other as long as it takes.
Until we can get through this. That's absolutely right. Well, Harold, I will say before we close here, even though you're right, you're separated from much of your family and your grandson, who I hope it's not bedtime for him. Hell, there's no school. He can stay up all night.
It's 8 o'clock. Are you kidding? We got 3 hours of
3 more hours of him. He's watching. And Harold, you've got your partner in crime, Edith, your wife, who's just such a wonderful woman.
She's been listening. I heard her groaning when I gave the start of the Seinfeld story.
I've not heard that. That's fantastic. Well, you know the Seinfeld episode in which George sees Keith Hernandez, right? And they're in a locker room, and George says, "Hey, it's Keith Hernandez," and I think he's a Civil War buff. I think that's Seinfeld says that. He's a Civil War buff, which is true. Hernandez, and Seinfeld said, or George says to Seinfeld, "I want to be a buff," and Seinfeld tells him, "Well, George, you got to read something to be a buff." And I just want to go back again to say that, you know what, that's what makes always talking with you, conversing with you, it's always so engaging. I always learn so much because you do what we need to do as historians, immerse ourselves in the sources and read. And so, if you get an opportunity, get to the Lincoln Forum. You'll see Harold in action and some other really fine Civil War historians as well. Well worth it.
Yes, thank you for coming on the live stream, Harold. This is an awesome opportunity for a lot of maybe new people to see you on here. So in a new way.
I'm really glad you asked me. I had a lot of fun, and it's always great to talk to Peter. I'm never sure I convinced him about anything because he's always very enigmatic about it. We've had lots of great.
You know what I tell my students? I want you to leave my class confused, and I
know you succeed.
Hey, Harold, take good care of yourself, man. Stay healthy. As I said hello as well.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you, Harold. Thank you, everyone.
When's
And
our next show, John?
Pardon?
When's our next show? It's Monday.
Next show is Monday nights. Everyone has to tune in. We have the event page up on the Facebook page, and we're going to have a lot more to come. We're going into late May at least. We might even go into June.
I think Monday night is Angie Zombeck, who is a professor at UNC Wilmington. She has written a book on Civil War prisons. She's going to talk a little bit about Civil War prisons in general, and then tell us her favorite Civil War prison escape stories. I don't know what that could be, but we'll find out on Monday.
We'll find out Monday evening, 7 o'clock. So thank you again, Harold.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.